Flashing lights pierced the darkness as sirens wailed in the distance. For most people, those sounds meant safety and protection, but for Marcus Johnson, they sent a chill down his spine. As a black man in America, even his position as a Secret Service agent couldn't shield him from the harsh realities of racial profiling. It was supposed to be a routine night. Marcus had just finished his shift, guarding a visiting foreign dignitary at a nearby hotel. Exhausted but satisfied with a job well done, he climbed into his car and headed home, looking forward to a quiet evening with his family. Little did he know, his badge and years of dedicated service were about to be put to the test in ways he never imagined. The first sign of trouble came when Marcus noticed a police cruiser tailing him closely. He checked his speed. Perfect, as always. His taillight? Working fine. Still, that nagging feeling in his gut told him something was off. Taking a deep breath, he signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, hoping to put the officer's mind at ease. But as the cop approached his window, Marcus could see the tension in his stance, the hand resting cautiously on his holster. This wasn't going to be a friendly chat. License and registration, the officer barked, his voice sharp with suspicion. Marcus complied, moving slowly and deliberately, keenly aware of how easily this situation could spiral out of control. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," came the next command. Marcus's heart raced as he carefully exited the car, his mind whirling with confusion and a growing sense of dread. What could he possibly have done wrong? As he turned to face the officer, he was met with not one, but 3 guns pointed directly at him. On the ground. Now, the shouts came from all directions as more police cars screeched to a halt around him. Marcus's training kicked in, and he lowered himself to the pavement, his cheek pressed against the cold asphalt. This can't be happening, he thought, struggling to make sense of the chaos erupting around him. As rough hands cuffed his wrists, Marcus found his voice. "There's been a mistake," he said, fighting to keep his tone calm and steady. "I'm a Secret Service agent. My credentials are in my wallet." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of doubt and growing unease. One of them cautiously approached Marcus's discarded wallet, flipping it open to reveal his official government ID. A tense silence fell over the scene as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The lead officer's face paled visibly as he realized the gravity of their error. But this was just the beginning. What unfolded next would send shockwaves through the community, igniting fierce debates about racial profiling, police accountability, and the deep-rooted issues plaguing America's justice system. As news of the incident spread like wildfire, it became clear that this was more than just a case of mistaken identity. It was a stark reminder of the biases and prejudices that continue to divide our nation. For Marcus, the night's events were a brutal wake-up call. Despite his years of service protecting the country's most important figures, in the eyes of some, he was still just another black man, suspicious, dangerous, guilty until proven innocent. The weight of this realization settled heavily on his shoulders as he struggled to process the injustice of it all. Back at the police station, a flurry of activity erupted as higher-ups scrambled to contain the situation. Phones rang off the hook as news outlets caught wind of the story, hungry for details about the wrongful arrest of a Secret Service agent. Social media exploded with outrage, cell phone footage of the incident going viral within hours. Marcus sat in a stark interrogation room, his wrists still bearing the marks of the handcuffs. As he recounted his version of events to internal affairs investigators, he couldn't help but wonder how many other innocent people had found themselves in similar situations, without the shield of a government badge to protect them. Outside, crowds began to gather, their angry voices carrying through the station's walls. Signs demanding justice and reform bobbed above the sea of protesters, a visual representation of the community's pain and frustration. This wasn't just about one man's wrongful arrest. It was about a system that seemed rigged against people of color from the start. As the night wore on, Marcus's colleagues from the Secret Service arrived, their faces etched with concern and barely contained fury. The sight of these highly trained agents, ready to go to bat for one of their own, added another layer of tension to the already volatile situation. Meanwhile, the officers involved in Marcus's arrest huddled with their superiors and union representatives, their careers hanging in the balance. How could they have made such a catastrophic error? And more importantly, how would they be held accountable? In the midst of the chaos, one question loomed large. What happens next? With the eyes of the nation focused squarely on this small police department, the decisions made in the coming hours and days would have far-reaching consequences. Would this incident spark meaningful change, or would it become just another headline, forgotten as soon as the next controversy emerged? As dawn broke, casting long shadows across the police station parking lot, Marcus finally emerged. Flanked by his fellow agents and looking weary but determined, he faced a wall of cameras and microphones. The world held its breath, waiting to hear what this man, who had experienced the best and worst of American law enforcement in a single night, had to say. Little did anyone know, Marcus's next words would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge the very foundations of policing in America. From the halls of power in Washington, D.C. to the streets of cities across the nation, the repercussions of this one fateful traffic stop would be felt for years to come. But as Marcus stepped up to the podium, his voice steady and his gaze unwavering, one thing became crystal clear. This was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. And what would unfold in the coming days and weeks would leave the entire country questioning everything they thought they knew about justice, equality, and what it truly means to protect and serve. As Marcus approached the podium, a hush fell over the crowd. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised over notepads, cameras zoomed in on his face. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. What he said next could change lives, maybe even save them. Last night, I experienced something that no American should ever have to face, Marcus began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. I was treated like a criminal, not because of anything I'd done, but because of the color of my skin. This isn't just my story. It's the story of countless black men and women across our nation who live in fear of the very people sworn to protect them. As Marcus recounted the harrowing details of his arrest, gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. He described the fear that gripped him as guns were drawn, the humiliation of being forced to the ground, and the disbelief when his credentials were finally acknowledged. But this isn't about me, Marcus continued, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces before him. It's about every person who's been pulled over for driving while black. It's about every parent who has to have the talk with their children about how to survive an encounter with law enforcement. It's about a system that's broken and desperately needs fixing. As Marcus stepped away from the microphone, the crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and angry shouts. His words had struck a chord, igniting a fire that had been smoldering for far too long. But while some saw Marcus as a hero speaking truth to power, others viewed him as a threat to the status quo. In the days that followed, Marcus's story dominated headlines across the country. Talk shows debated the incident endlessly, social media exploded with hashtags demanding justice, and protesters took to the streets in cities nationwide. The police department found itself under intense scrutiny, with calls for the officers involved to be fired and charged. But as the public outcry grew louder, so did the pushback. Police unions rallied around the officers, claiming they had followed protocol and that Marcus's arrest was an unfortunate but understandable mistake. Right-wing pundits accused Marcus of exaggerating the incident for political gain, questioning why a Secret Service agent would be driving alone late at night. Caught in the middle of this storm, Marcus struggled to maintain his composure. He had never wanted to be the face of a movement, but now found himself thrust into that role. Late at night, when the cameras were off and the house was quiet, doubts crept in. Was he doing the right thing? Would speaking out jeopardize his career, his family's safety? Meanwhile, behind closed doors, a different kind of drama was unfolding. In the halls of power, from the local police chief's office to the highest levels of government, frantic meetings were taking place. How could they contain this situation? What changes, if any, were they willing to make? The police chief, a veteran officer named Frank Holloway, found himself in an impossible position. He knew the officers involved, had worked alongside them for years. They weren't bad men, he believed, just products of a flawed system. But as he reviewed the body-cam footage of Marcus's arrest, he couldn't deny the ugly truth staring him in the face. Across town, in a dimly lit bar, Officer Mike Brennan, one of the cops involved in the arrest, nursed a whiskey, his mind replaying the events of that night over and over. He had always prided himself on being one of the good ones, an officer who treated everyone fairly. How had he gotten it so wrong? The shame and guilt gnawed at him, but so did a creeping resentment. Why was he being vilified for doing his job? As the controversy raged on, unexpected allies emerged. Civil rights leaders who had long criticized law enforcement practices now found themselves working alongside reform-minded police officials. Community organizers teamed up with local politicians to draft proposals for new training programs and accountability measures. But for every step forward, there seemed to be two steps back. Old wounds were reopened, long-simmering tensions boiled over. In some neighborhoods, residents reported feeling even more afraid of the police, worried that officers might be on edge and quick to react. Marcus, for his part, tried to navigate this complex landscape with grace and determination. He met with community leaders, spoke at rallies, and even sat down with some of the officers involved in his arrest. These conversations were often tense and uncomfortable, but they also offered glimmers of hope, moments of genuine understanding and shared humanity. As weeks turned into months, the initial furor began to die down, but the underlying issues remained unresolved. Promises of reform were made, task forces were assembled, and reports were commissioned. But for many in the community, these felt like empty gestures. Too little, too late. Then, just as it seemed the story might fade from public consciousness, a bombshell revelation rocked the case. An anonymous source within the police department leaked information suggesting that Marcus's arrest wasn't a simple mistake, but part of a larger pattern of targeted harassment against people of color. The leak alleged that certain officers had been involved in a series of similar incidents, all swept under the rug by department higher-ups. If true, this would transform Marcus's case from an isolated incident into evidence of systemic corruption. As investigators scrambled to verify the claims, tensions in the city reached a boiling point. Protesters once again filled the streets, demanding answers and accountability. The police department closed ranks, with the chief denouncing the leak as unsubstantiated rumors spread by disgruntled employees. For Marcus, this new development brought a fresh wave of anxiety and resolve. If the allegations were true, it meant his ordeal was just the tip of the iceberg. How many others had suffered in silence, without the platform or protection his position afforded him? As he prepared to testify before a hastily assembled Congressional committee, Marcus knew that his words could shape the national conversation on policing and race for years to come. But he also knew that powerful forces would resist any meaningful change, fighting tooth and nail to maintain the status quo. The night before his testimony, Marcus sat alone in his study, poring over his prepared statement. The weight of expectation pressed down on him, the hopes of his community, the fears of his fellow officers, the scrutiny of the entire nation. As he made final edits to his speech, a notification popped up on his phone, another leaked document, this one even more damning than the last. Marcus's hand hovered over the link, his heart pounding. Whatever was in that document could change everything. But did he have the strength to face what it might reveal? As he debated whether to open it, the true depth of the conspiracy began to unravel, promising to shake the foundations of law enforcement across the country. Marcus's finger trembled as he tapped the link, his eyes widening as he scrolled through the document. What he saw made his blood run cold, a detailed log of targeted stops, false arrests, and cover-ups stretching back years. His own name was there, alongside dozens of others. This wasn't just a few bad apples, it was a rotten orchard. As dawn broke, Marcus steeled himself for the hearing. The weight of what he'd learned pressed heavily on his shoulders as he entered the imposing government building. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but Marcus kept his eyes forward, focused on the task ahead. Inside the hearing room, tensions crackled like static electricity. Senators from both parties jockeyed for position, each hoping to score political points. As Marcus took his seat, he locked eyes with Police Chief Holloway across the room. The older man's face was a mask of stone, but a flicker of something, fear, guilt, passed behind his eyes. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Mike Brennan paced his small apartment, the TV tuned to the hearing. He'd been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, his career hanging by a thread. As he watched Marcus begin his testimony, a war raged inside him. Part of him wanted to speak out, to confess everything he'd seen and done. But another part, the part that remembered the thin blue line, held him back. In a rundown community center, a group of local activists huddled around a laptop, streaming the hearing. Among them was Shanice Taylor, whose brother had been wrongfully arrested last year in an incident eerily similar to Marcus's. As Marcus spoke, Shanice felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone would finally listen. Back in the hearing room, Marcus's measured words cut through the political grandstanding. He spoke of his ordeal, but also of the larger issues at play: implicit bias, lack of accountability, the erosion of trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. As he neared the end of his prepared statement, Marcus paused, his next words unscripted. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident," he said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "I've seen evidence of a systemic problem, one that goes far beyond a few misguided officers. It's a cancer eating away at the heart of our justice system, and it needs to be cut out." A collective gasp rippled through the room. This was more than anyone had expected, even those who'd seen the leaked documents. Marcus had just lobbed a grenade into the proceedings, and now all hell was about to break loose. As the senators erupted into a frenzy of questions, Chief Holloway slipped out of the room, his face ashen. He fumbled for his phone, fingers shaking as he dialed a number he'd hoped never to use. "It's happening," he said simply when the call connected. "We need to initiate Protocol Omega." Across the city, a flurry of activity erupted. Files were shredded, hard drives wiped, burner phones discarded. A shadowy network that had operated with impunity for years suddenly found itself scrambling for cover. Outside the hearing room, reporters swarmed Marcus as he attempted to leave. "Agent Johnson, can you elaborate on your allegations? Who else is involved? How high up does this go?" The questions came rapid fire, but Marcus kept walking, his security detail forming a human shield around him. As news of Marcus's bombshell testimony spread, reactions varied wildly. In some neighborhoods, people poured into the streets in celebration, feeling that finally their voices were being heard. In others, particularly those with strong ties to law enforcement, there was anger and disbelief. How dare this man tarnish the reputation of those who put their lives on the line every day? Officer Brennan watched it all unfold on his TV, a sick feeling growing in his stomach. He knew things that could corroborate Marcus's claims, maybe even expand on them. But coming forward would mean the end of his career, possibly even jail time. As he wrestled with his conscience, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you." In her office downtown, District Attorney Elena Rodriguez found herself in a similar quandary. She'd had suspicions about certain cases for years, patterns that didn't quite add up. But pursuing them would mean going up against the police union, jeopardizing ongoing prosecutions, maybe even risking her own safety. As she weighed her options, a knock at her door made her jump. It was her assistant, looking pale. "Ma'am, there are some federal agents here to see you." Back at the community center, Shanice and her fellow activists were mobilizing. Marcus's testimony had given them the ammunition they needed to demand real change. They organized marches, petition drives, and voter registration efforts. But as their movement gained momentum, so did the pushback. Threatening messages appeared on social media, and Shanice could swear she was being followed on her way home from meetings. As night fell, Marcus finally returned home, exhausted but resolute. His wife met him at the door, her face a mix of pride and worry. "You did the right thing," she said, pulling him into a tight embrace. But as they stood there in the darkened hallway, neither could shake the feeling that their lives would never be the same. In the shadows across the street, a figure watched the Johnson house, speaking quietly into a radio. "Target is home, awaiting further instructions." The response came back crackling and indistinct, but the message was clear: this was far from over. As the city slept, uneasy and divided, the stage was set for a showdown that would test the very foundations of justice and accountability. Marcus had lit the fuse, but where the explosion would lead, no one could say. One thing was certain: there would be no going back to the way things were before. As dawn broke over the city, an uneasy calm settled in the streets. But beneath the surface, tension simmered, ready to boil over at any moment. Marcus Johnson woke to find his house surrounded by a phalanx of Secret Service agents, their presence both reassuring and unsettling. The threats against him and his family had escalated overnight, forcing his superiors to take extraordinary measures. Across town, Officer Mike Brennan stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, dark circles under his eyes betraying a sleepless night. The anonymous text message echoed in his mind, its threat hanging over him like a storm cloud. But as he splashed water on his face, a new resolve began to form. He couldn't stay silent any longer, no matter the cost. At the police station, Chief Holloway barked orders at his lieutenants, his usual composure cracking under the strain. "I want every file related to those traffic stops locked down," he growled, sweat beading on his forehead. "And find out who leaked those documents, or it'll be all our heads on the chopping block." Meanwhile, District Attorney Elena Rodriguez sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of case files. The visit from the federal agents had left her shaken, but also determined. As she pored over years of arrest records and court transcripts, patterns began to emerge. Patterns that pointed to a conspiracy far larger than she had ever imagined. In a dingy motel room on the outskirts of town, a group of officers gathered in secret. These were the hardliners, the ones who believed Marcus Johnson and his allies were a threat to everything they stood for. "We need to send a message," one of them said, his voice low and dangerous. "Show them what happens when you cross the thin blue line." As the morning wore on, Marcus prepared for another day of testimony. But as he adjusted his tie, a breaking news alert flashed across the TV screen. A body had been found in the river, a young black man, handcuffed and bearing signs of a struggle. The reporter's words sent to chill down Marcus's spine. Sources say the victim may have been a key witness in the ongoing police corruption investigation. Across the city, Janice Taylor and her fellow activists sprang into action. They knew this was no coincidence, and they weren't about to let it be swept under the rug. As they organized an emergency protest, word spread through social media like wildfire. By noon, thousands had gathered in front of the police station, their chants echoing off the buildings. No justice, no peace. Inside the station, chaos reigned. Officers scrambled to contain the growing crowd outside while also dealing with the fallout from the morning's grim discovery. In his office, Chief Holloway fielded angry calls from city officials and union representatives alike. As the pressure mounted, he reached for the bottom drawer of his desk, where a loaded gun and a bottle of whiskey waited. At the courthouse, Elena Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. Armed with the evidence she'd uncovered, she marched into the judge's chambers and requested an emergency warrant. "We need to move now," she insisted, her voice urgent, "before they can destroy any more evidence." As federal agents prepared to raid multiple locations across the city, Officer Brennan found himself at a crossroads. His phone buzzed with increasingly frantic messages from his fellow officers, urging him to stay quiet. But as he watched footage of the protests on TV, something inside him snapped. Grabbing his badge and gun, he headed for the door, determined to tell the truth no matter the consequences. Back at the Congressional hearing, Marcus took his seat, acutely aware of the empty chair next to him. The chair where the young man found in the river was supposed to have sat. As the cameras rolled and the senators leaned in, Marcus cleared his throat. "Before we continue," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his gut, "there's something else you need to know." Outside, the protest had swelled to unprecedented numbers. People of all ages and backgrounds stood shoulder to shoulder, united in their demand for justice. But as the sun began to set, a new tension filled the air. Rumors spread of riot police mobilizing, of provocateurs in the crowd. Janice and her fellow organizers worked frantically to keep things peaceful, but they could feel control slipping away. As night fell, the city teetered on the brink of chaos. Federal agents moved in on their targets, protesters and police faced off in the streets, and long-buried secrets threatened to explode into the open. In living rooms and boardrooms, on street corners, and in squad cars, everyone held their breath, waiting to see how it would all play out. In the hearing room, Marcus leaned towards the microphone, ready to reveal the final piece of the puzzle, the evidence that would blow the lid off the entire conspiracy. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, the lights in the room flickered and went out, plunging everything into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then, chaos erupted. Shouts and screams filled the air as people stumbled in the dark. Through the confusion, Marcus felt a hand grab his arm, pulling him roughly from his seat. A voice hissed in his ear. "You should have kept your mouth shut, Johnson." As Marcus struggled against his unseen assailant, sirens wailed in the distance and gunshots echoed through the city streets. The powder keg had been lit, and now all of America watched in shock as the explosion began to unfold. In the pitch-black hearing room, Marcus's training kicked in. He twisted out of his assailant's grasp, his fist connecting with something solid. A grunt of pain, then the sound of a body hitting the floor. Suddenly, emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie glow over the scene. Marcus found himself face to face with a man he recognized. Not a rogue cop or shadowy conspirator, but one of his own colleagues from the Secret Service. Why? Marcus gasped, struggling to comprehend this betrayal. Before the man could answer, the doors burst open. Federal agents poured in, weapons drawn. "Everyone down!" they shouted, their eyes scanning the room for threats. As Marcus was ushered to safety, he caught a glimpse of his attacker being handcuffed. The look of defeat in the man's eyes sent a chill down Marcus's spine. How deep did this corruption go? Outside, the city had erupted into chaos. What started as peaceful protests had devolved into running battles between demonstrators and riot police. Tear gas clouded the air, and the crackle of police radios mingled with angry chants and breaking glass. Shanice Taylor found herself in the thick of it, trying desperately to calm the crowd. "This isn't what we're about," she shouted through a megaphone. "We can't fight injustice with more injustice." But her words were drowned out by the roar of a police helicopter overhead. As the night wore on, a new and terrifying development emerged. Reports began trickling in of armed militia groups converging on the city. These self-styled patriots claimed they were coming to restore order, but their presence only added fuel to the fire. At the police station, Chief Holloway watched the feeds from street cameras with growing horror. This was spiraling out of control faster than he could have imagined. As he reached for his phone to call for National Guard support, the door to his office flew open. Officer Mike Brennan stood there, wild-eyed and breathless. "Chief," he panted, "you need to see this." He thrust a USB drive into Holloway's hands. "It's all here, every dirty deal, every cover-up, and it goes way higher than we thought." As Holloway plugged in the drive with trembling hands, his computer screen filled with documents, photos, and videos. His eyes widened as he scrolled through the files. This wasn't just about racist cops or a corrupt department. This was evidence of a nationwide network involving politicians, judges, and even federal agencies. Across town, District Attorney Elena Rodriguez was making a similar discovery. The warrant she'd obtained had led to a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. But as she dug deeper, she realized the full scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just a local issue. It was a cancer that had metastasized throughout the entire justice system. Back at the Congressional hearing, now relocated to a secure location, Marcus finally had the chance to present his evidence. As he laid out the details of the conspiracy, connecting dots that spanned decades and crossed state lines, the room fell into a stunned silence. One senator, his face ashen, spoke up. "If what you're saying is true, Agent Johnson, we're looking at the biggest scandal in American history." Marcus nodded gravely. "And I've only scratched the surface," he replied. As dawn broke over the smoldering city, a new threat emerged. Hackers, claiming to be aligned with the protest movement, announced they had gained access to police and government servers. They threatened to release everything, every corrupt deal, every covered-up crime, every abuse of power, unless their demands for systemic reform were met. The nation held its breath, poised on the brink of a revelation that could tear the very fabric of society apart. In living rooms and newsrooms across America, people watched in disbelief as the story unfolded. This was no longer just about one man's wrongful arrest or one city's corrupt police force. It was about the very foundations of justice and democracy in America. As Marcus prepared to go live on national television to address the nation, he felt the weight of history on his shoulders. He knew that what he said next could either heal the deep wounds in American society or rip them wide open. Just as he was about to step in front of the cameras, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message contained just 4 words, but they made his blood run cold. "The truth stops here." Marcus hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. He thought of his family, of the risks he'd already taken, of the chaos engulfing the nation. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was he doing the right thing? Could the country handle the whole truth? But then he thought of all the lives ruined by injustice, of the young man found in the river, of Shanice and countless others fighting for change. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and pushed open the door. As Marcus stepped into the glare of the studio lights, millions of Americans leaned towards their screens, unaware that what they were about to hear would change the course of history forever. The truth was about to come out, and nothing would ever be the same again. Marcus took a deep breath and began to speak, his words measured and clear. My fellow Americans, what I'm about to share will shock and disturb you, but the truth must come to light. He laid out the evidence, piece by damning piece, exposing a web of corruption that stretched from local precincts to the highest levels of government. As Marcus spoke, footage began to play on screens behind him, body cam videos, surveillance tapes, recorded conversations. The evidence was irrefutable. America watched in stunned silence as decades of systemic injustice were laid bare. Across the country, reactions were swift and intense. Protesters took to the streets in unprecedented numbers, their voices united in a demand for change. Police stations were inundated with calls from officers wanting to come clean, to be on the right side of history. In Washington, the halls of power were thrown into chaos. Emergency sessions were called, resignations poured in, and calls for impeachment echoed through Congress. The president himself, looking shaken, addressed the nation, promising swift action and comprehensive reform. As the dust began to settle, Marcus found himself hailed as a hero by many, a traitor by others. But he knew the fight was far from over. The system wouldn't change overnight, and those who had profited from corruption wouldn't go down without a fight. In the weeks that followed, a wave of reforms swept the nation. Police departments were overhauled, oversight committees established, and long-ignored community voices were finally heard. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Officer Mike Brennan, who had risked everything to come forward, found an unlikely ally in Shanice Taylor. Together, they worked to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community, showing that change was possible when people came together. Chief Holloway, facing charges but cooperating with investigators, provided crucial information that helped bring down bigger fish. His testimony in a series of high-profile trials captivated the nation, exposing the deep-rooted nature of the problem. As the story seemed to be winding down, with justice apparently being served and reforms taking hold, a final, shocking twist emerged. A group of investigative journalists, following leads from the hacked data, uncovered evidence of foreign interference. It appeared that hostile powers had been exploiting and exacerbating racial tensions and police misconduct for years, aiming to destabilize American society from within. This revelation added a new layer of complexity to an already fraught situation. It raised difficult questions about national security, social media manipulation, and the very nature of America's divisions. The nation found itself grappling not just with internal injustices, but with the realization that these issues had been weaponized by outside forces. Marcus, watching this new chapter unfold from the sidelines, realized that his journey was far from over. The fight for justice and equality was more critical than ever, extending beyond the borders of America to the global stage. As the sun set on another tumultuous day, Marcus stood at his window, looking out over the city he had helped to change. He thought about how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, he felt genuine hope. His phone buzzed, a message from Shanice. "Turn on the news," it read. "You won't believe what's happening now." Marcus reached for the remote, his heart racing. As the screen flickered to life, he realized that this story, his story, America's story, was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The newscast opened with a breaking story that would once again shake the foundations of the nation. As Marcus watched, he knew that the next chapter would be even more challenging, more vital than the last. But this time, he wasn't facing it alone. Across America, millions of citizens stood ready to continue the fight for justice, truth, and the promise of a better tomorrow. As the reporter's voice filled the room, Marcus straightened his shoulders. Whatever came next, he was ready. The truth had come to light, and now the real work could begin. Marcus sat in stunned silence as the news anchor's words sank in. The foreign interference wasn't just about sowing discord. It was part of a larger plot to undermine America's standing on the world stage. As he processed this information, his phone lit up with calls and messages from colleagues, activists, and journalists, all seeking his insight on this latest development. In the days that followed, Marcus found himself thrust back into the spotlight. He testified before international committees, worked with intelligence agencies, and helped craft strategies to combat disinformation. The skills that had made him an excellent Secret Service agent now served him in a different, equally crucial role, defending democracy itself. Shanice Taylor, meanwhile, channeled the energy of the protest movement into concrete action. She ran for city council and won, becoming a powerful voice for reform and community engagement. Her first-hand experience of both the protests and the behind-the-scenes negotiations made her uniquely qualified to bridge divides and push for meaningful change. Officer Mike Brennan, having faced his own demons and chosen to stand up for what was right, found a new calling. He traveled the country, speaking to police academies and departments about the importance of integrity and community trust. His candid accounts of his own struggles and eventual redemption resonated with officers young and old, helping to shift the culture from within. Chief Holloway, after serving time for his role in the corruption, emerged as an unlikely advocate for police reform. His insider knowledge, combined with his genuine remorse, make him a powerful voice in the ongoing national conversation about law enforcement and justice. As months turned into years, the changes sparked by Marcus's revelations began to take root. Police departments across the country implemented new training programs, focusing on de-escalation techniques and community relations. Civilian oversight boards gained real power, and transparency became the norm rather than the exception. But the road wasn't always smooth. There were setbacks, resistance from entrenched interests, and moments when it seemed like the old ways might creep back in. Yet each time, a newly engaged citizenry stood firm, holding their leaders and institutions accountable. The foreign interference angle added a new dimension to the fight. Social media companies, forced to confront their role in spreading disinformation, implemented stricter policies and worked more closely with fact-checkers. Digital literacy programs were introduced in schools, teaching young people to critically evaluate the information they encountered online. Marcus, watching these developments unfold, felt a mix of pride and humility. He knew that his actions had been a catalyst, but the real change came from countless individuals choosing to stand up, speak out, and do the hard work of reforming a deeply flawed system. 5 years after that fateful traffic stop, Marcus stood at a podium, preparing to address a crowd gathered for the opening of a new community center. The building, named after the young man whose death in the river had nearly been swept under the rug, stood as a symbol of how far they'd come, and how far they still had to go. As Marcus looked out over the sea of faces, black, white, brown, young, old, civilians, and police officers, he felt a surge of emotion. 5 years ago, he began, his voice steady, I stood before you as a man who had been wronged, who had seen the worst of what our system could do. Today, I stand before you as a witness to what we can achieve when we come together, face hard truths, and commit to real change. He spoke of the progress they'd made, the reforms, the new laws, the shifts in culture and attitude. But he also acknowledged the work that remained. We've laid a foundation, he said, but it's up to all of us to build on it, every day, in ways both big and small. As Marcus concluded his speech, a familiar face caught his eye in the crowd. It was the officer who had first pulled him over that night, the one who had set this whole chain of events in motion. Their eyes met, and the officer gave a small, solemn nod, an acknowledgement of how far they'd both come, and of the shared journey that still lay ahead. After the ceremony, Marcus found a quiet moment with Shanice and Mike, the unlikely trio, a former Secret Service agent, a community activist turned politician, and a reformed police officer, had become the face of a new approach to justice and community relations. Sometimes I still can't believe how this all started, Shanice mused, shaking her head. A traffic stop that turned into a national reckoning. Mike nodded, his expression thoughtful. It makes you wonder how many other Marcus Johnsons are out there whose stories never came to light. That's why we can't stop, Marcus said firmly. This isn't just about me, or this city, or even this country. It's about setting an example for the world, showing that change is possible if we're willing to fight for it. As they parted ways, each heading off to their next commitment in the ongoing work of reform, Marcus felt a sense of purpose stronger than any he'd known in his years of protecting presidents and diplomats. He was protecting something even more important now, the very ideals of justice and equality that America was founded upon. That night, as Marcus sat down to dinner with his family, his phone buzzed with a news alert. Another police department, in a city clear across the country, had just announced a sweeping set of reforms modeled on the changes Marcus had helped implement. He smiled, thinking of the ripple effects of that one moment of injustice turned into a force for positive change. His daughter, noticing his expression, asked what he was smiling about. Marcus thought for a moment, then said, "I'm smiling because even when things seem darkest, there's always hope. And when people come together to demand better, real change is possible." As he looked around the table at his loved ones, Marcus felt a deep sense of gratitude. The road had been hard, the price high, but the result, a more just, more transparent, more equitable system, was worth every sacrifice. Outside, the city hummed with life. Peaceful protesters marching for ongoing reforms, community meetings discussing local issues, police officers engaging in friendly conversations with residents. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was progress. Real, tangible progress. And as Marcus drifted off to sleep that night, he knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight, but he was ready. They were all ready, because now they knew the power of one voice speaking truth, of communities coming together, of a nation facing its flaws and striving to do better. The story of Marcus Johnson, from wrongfully arrested Secret Service agent to catalyst for national change, would be told for generations. But more importantly, it would be lived in the ongoing work of building a more just and equitable society. As Marcus had said in his speech, they had laid the foundation. Now it was up to all of them to build on it, every day, in ways both big and small. And so, as a new day dawned, the work continued, not just in Marcus's city, but in cities and towns across America and beyond. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a long time, it was clear. And they were walking it together, step by step, towards a future where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a reality for all.